Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and we are here for our fourth Q&A with John Dominic Crossan, part of the Jesus in Galilee class this Lent. And we got a bunch of really excellent questions from everyone that's part of the group. If you aren't a part of the group and want to check out all the lectures that are inspiring the questions, then head over to crossanclass.com. You can join up, donate anything, including zero, get access to them, and then you can send in your questions for next week, our last live Q&A, where we've already been getting questions that weave together the stuff that Dom presented in these lectures and we've talked about in the Q&As with a host of his other work and the other classes we've done together. So I'm super excited about those. It's going to be fun. And now it's St. Patrick's Day, Dom. So I know you're excited.
I know. That's why I have this slight green halo, because I'm in front of a green screen, of course, behind my virtual background, and it's showing my white hair as green. That's in honor of St. Patrick's Day. I dyed it. The
Yeah.
little there is.
Well, we can go ahead and start jumping into some questions. Ellen has first one here. You open with Kafka's parable. A man rides away from home not knowing his destination. Only that is away from here. Only that's away from here. How does that frame what you mean when you say a parable is a very short story pointing elsewhere?
Okay, that was my definition. A very short story pointing elsewhere. You could read a short story, of course, thoroughly enjoy it and put it down and it's finished. But these are very short stories. And that's the first index that, hey, something that's weird is going on. A story that's only a paragraph? There's something else going on here. So pointing elsewhere. And I thought that was a marvelous parable of parabling, because the only thing you know about a parable is elsewhere. You don't get the message here. Well, where do you get it? That's the problem. Okay. So thank you, Ellen. Yes, pointing elsewhere with Kafka.
All right. Thomas asks, C.H. Dodd says a parable tenses the mind into active thought, teases the mind into active thought. You put that in capitals. What does active thought mean? And why does the phrase anchor your whole argument about what parables are for?
Okay. I must have been sometime in the 50s when I read that definition in Dodd. I mean, I think he wrote it in 1934. I was getting born, so I wasn't doing much reading. But I think it gets quoted all the time, but I can only understand active thought as meaning action. I mean, what is active thought? I mean, a thought is always a thought. So I guess it's active, except when you're asleep or something. So it must be put into action. And of course, the example that Dodd uses in his famous parables of the kingdom, right after that is the story about Nathan when David has to say, originate the state of you're the man to David. It doesn't quite mean it in the sense we use it. So active thought, I think, means it's a lure for action, not just for thinking, hey, that's a really good parable, Jesus. Imagine the crowd passing Jesus afterwards and saying, lovely parable this morning, Rabbi. Really good. That's a failure. What's the action? Okay, thank you, Thomas.
All right. This is from Naomi. You describe three subgenres: riddle parables, example parables, and challenge parables. Can you define each one clearly and then show what parabolic slippage looks like when the tradition slides one into another?
I did this, Nima, because you have to explain what's going on. How come Mark makes them all riddle parables, or riddles in plain language, and then Luke loves example parables? So what's going on? So I made one genre, a very short story pointing elsewhere. That's my definition of this genre. And then three subgenres. That's my suggestion. If it helps, keep it. If it doesn't, forget it. So a riddle parable. Well, for example, if you've ever listened or know the story of Puccini's opera Turandot, she has three riddles, and the poor guy has to answer all three of them. If he fails it, he gets killed. If he gets it, he gets married. Maybe some people would think it's the same deal if you're dealing with Turandot, marriage and getting killed. It's hard to know which is the better deal, but they're riddles. The first one is what is there every night but is gone by dawn, something like that. What is there every night, what is present every night but gone by dawn? And the answer is hope. And so he solves the three riddles. I mean, in the past, you also get it in Samson in the book of Judges. Riddles were serious tests because very often your life was dependent on them, because in the ancient world, knowledge was what they needed. Now, we're in a different world. We have too much knowledge and not enough wisdom. But in the ancient world, they taught a lot about knowledge. So riddles. Example parables are simply a story that tells you, go and do likewise, or don't go and do likewise. It's a kind of a moral tale. I won't give any examples, so we'll be getting into them later. Now, a challenge parable is a story which is intended to annoy you and to make you think by poking you, like you poke a fire with, it annoys me. I don't like that. Why did he say that? Supposing somebody tells a story on television, and everybody goes, I didn't like that. Why did he tell that? Why did he tell that? Or why did he tell it that way? That's when you're running into a parable. It annoys you. It provokes you into thought or lures you into thought. So the slippage is, if you hear one, could you say, no, is that a riddle? Or is it an example I'm supposed to follow or not follow? Or is it challenging my values or the values of my society? What's going on? And these are simply sub-guides to know which way you might want to go. Thank you, Naomi.
Mm-hmm. James had a question using the Nathan and David story. Nathan tells David the story of the stolen ewe lamb. David falls into the trap and condemns the man, then hears, you are the man. Is that a riddle, an example, or challenge? And does getting it right change how we read David when reading the story?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a challenge. I mean, supposing you read there's a riddle that said, ooh, I wonder what's going on here. Must be something about a lamb. Or maybe it's you could argue it. An example, you could say, ooh, I don't think he should have done that. So I know better. I wouldn't have done that. That's an example. A challenge, but this is between Nathan and David. We're listening, as it were. It's a challenge to see if David will recognize he's speaking about me. And he's right, because there are some rulers who, even if you tell them they're wrong, will never admit they're wrong, are constitutionally incapable of admitting error because maybe their whole life is an error. David, however, recognizes it, and to his honor, because he's done an unspeakable thing. It's a royal rape of Bathsheba. And then, of course, the cover-up, I don't want to say it's worse than the rape, but it's bad. The cover-up, Uriah is an honorable person, comes home, and because his army's in the tents, as he says, he won't go near his wife. And David gets him drunk to make him go to his wife. The whole story, you want to say, ay. Boy, the Bible is honest on David. So it's a challenge. And it's a challenge, of course, to any ruler or anyone who abuses their power anywhere ever. Will you at least confess what you did? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right. Diana asks, you say Mark turns parables into punitive riddles, incomprehensible to outsiders, explained privately to insiders. But Jesus keeps saying, let anyone with ears listen. How do you hold those two things in common in the same gospel?
Well, Diana, it's very simple. Mark is wrong. Like so many cases, they're easily solved if you admit that sometimes an evangelist can be wrong. For example, the first time Mark uses the word parable, it's not in chapter 4, it's in chapter 3, when the family comes off criticizing Jesus, and the Pharisees, I think, from Jerusalem criticize Jesus. And in response, for the first time, he speaks in parables, and it's clearly punitive. Okay, you reject me, I'll tell you a story and you won't know what it means. And of course, then in chapter 4, chapter 7 again, Jesus tells a parable to outsiders, explains it to the insiders. And by the way, the insiders ain't any better than the outsiders in Mark. They don't get it either. So in effect, nobody gets the parables in Mark. But wait a minute, Jesus says, you got ears, listen. That seems to mean all you got to do is hear. So, in a way, Mark beautifully contradicts himself. And you remember the parable in chapter 4, you don't bring a light into the room and put it under a bucket or a bushel. Well, then Jesus, then you shouldn't be telling parables that nobody understands. No. Poor Mark is kind of lost, to be honest with you. He's trying to figure out what on earth's going on. And he doesn't do it very well. Thank you, Diana.
All right. Frank asks, you say the parable of the sower is not about sowing. It's a challenge parable about the act of paraling itself. What is Jesus conceding about his own method when he tells a story about seeds that mostly fail?
Okay, let me imagine now somebody listening to it. Listen, not Jesus for a moment. Somebody is listening. They're listening to this story and they're thinking at the end of it, this is weird. He's just spent an hour, because I think Jesus never did these quickie parables, that take 5 seconds to get through. He probably mimed it out and they argued it backwards and forwards and people were interrupting him and all the rest of it, of an oral situation. But he says this, and at the end, the guy says to his neighbor, he's just spent the time telling me something I knew since I was about 7 or 8 years of age when I was out in the fields with my parents. Of course you don't you watch for the birds. Of course you watch for the thorns. And of course you watch for the rocks. Every idiot knows that. Why did he spend an hour? And the guy says to him, Benjamin, it's a parable. What's a parable? Well, I don't know, but that was one of them. So it's not about sowing? No, it's not about sowing. But why did he talk about sowing? The only thing you know, Benjamin, at the end of it is it's not about sowing. So I have to think what it is. You got it. You have to think what it's about. Now, look at the parable, though. Everyone says there's 3 degrees of failure. And of course there are. But the end, now I'm talking in Mark, the earliest version we have. Well, I don't think the one in Gospel, Thomas, you might argue. But in any case, Mark has 3 degrees of success, 30, 60. And when you're expecting 90, of course, a good oral player goes to 100. So you got 3 degrees of failure. You got 3 degrees of success. Everyone knows that. That's exactly what happens when you go sowing. So Jesus, I think, is telling his hearers, I accept that there will be people who will not get it, or who will get some of it, or who won't get it at all. That's the way of parabling. So I think this is Jesus' own parable of parabling. He accepts the limitations of parable, that the audience might blow it. They might go home after that and say, wow, great agriculture lesson this morning. Gotta really watch for the birds. Thank you.
All right. Carol asks, the parable of the vineyard tenants is usually read as an allegory. The son is Jesus, the servants are prophets. You say that's slippage. What does the story actually provoke in a first century audience facing an absentee landlord?
Well, Carol, this is the problem that we really have. All of us, including myself, would like to have these with a nice simple, what does it mean? It means X. And that works for riddles, by the way. There's only usually one good answer to a riddle. There's not about 8 options. So here we have a parable. Now, in the first century, I can't honestly imagine, even if Jesus intended it to be a glorious prophecy about his future. Let's give him that for a moment. Divine knowledge of what's going to happen, and he says it. I don't believe a person in the audience would get it. What they would get is, wow, these people, this is an absentee landlord. Okay, we all know about absentee vineyard owners. Absentee landlords don't have any compassion when you got a bad harvest. They just won't believe it. We had bad weather all year. No, well, you bunch of lazy no goods. No. Absentee landlords we don't like. So we understand these people decided to kill the messengers and get the vineyard. But they're not going to get the vineyard. The troops are coming. They're going to be dead. No. I can't not see that provoking an argument for violence, for non-violence, for all the options they have. And they have other options besides killing them. They could stop working. So I think this is an education on response to the social situation. And vineyards, especially, are heavy labor intensive. 10 years before you're going to get anything. So you need a lot of money. It's capitalization is heavy in a vineyard, the intense work at times. So, yeah, we know about vineyards. We understand it. Now, will they get away with it? Is it a good policy, or is it basically postponed suicide? Thank you, Carol.
All right. Andrew asks, you say Luke is running an example factory when dealing with the parables. What does the Good Samaritan lose when it becomes a lesson in compassion? And what does it recover when you read it as a challenge to the whole idea of ethnic enmity?
Okay, I don't know if I use that term example factory, Andrew, but it's lovely. Thank you very much. It's perfect for Luke, actually.
I don't know. When I read it, I thought it sounded as witty as you are. So,
Okay, honestly, I will give that credit for that. So I don't remember it if I actually said it. Anyway, Andrew. Okay, here. Now the presumption is, of course, the presumption is that if you find somebody in the ditch, you should help him. That's the basic presumption of the story. Otherwise, the whole story falls on its face. If you should go over and see if there's anything else you can rob him of, that's a different morality. So that's taken for granted. And if Jesus wanted to give you a compassion story, for example, he should have put somebody in the ditch and somebody, no names, somebody helping them. If he wanted to push it a little bit, to even if you find your enemy in the ditch, you should help him. Put the Samaritan in the ditch, and then a Jew should help. And the audience might say, yeah, well, I don't know if I'd help a Samaritan, but yeah, I suppose we should really. Well, yeah, I suppose. Okay, it's a nice idea. We mightn't do it, Jesus, but yeah, you're probably right. We should. What Jesus does is put the Jew in the ditch, obviously one of us in the ditch, and the, what you might call the morally good people, examples, the priest and the Levite pass by, and the Samaritan stops. Now, rerun that anyway. And if you wanted a Christian retelling, you could put let's say maybe a Pharisee in the ditch, and a relative of Jesus passes by, and one of the 12 pass by, the pagan stops. That would be the challenge. The challenge is that those you expect to help don't help, and those you don't expect to help, help. Now, what does that do about how I know the goods and the bads? Now, you can make up the story anyway. That's the structure. The good people, however you expect them to be, don't help, and the surprise one does. Now, the challenge is, how secure are you that all the Samaritans are bad? Do you just say, well, we found one good one. Okay, there's one good Samaritan. Come on, just one you happened to be on the road that afternoon. So it challenges the security of your ins and outs. That's a challenge parable. Thank you, Andrew.
Mm-hmm. All right. Priya, who always sends plenty of questions.
Priya, nice to see you again.
She said, you say the parable of vineyard workers is not about divine grace. That reading lets the owner off the hook. What is the story doing when it shows workers standing idle all day at high harvest and then blames them for it?
It's perfectly modern, honestly, Priya. It could be right now. I thought of it the last time the Crossan pilgrimage took 40 people to Ireland. And as we were traveling through small towns, and town after town, there was a group of people standing to be hired that day, morning after morning. And there were foreigners. And I'd never seen this. In the Ireland I grew up in, everyone was leaving to get a job. Now foreigners were coming into Ireland to get a job. This was clearly in New York, but they were standing. They were standing. And so that struck me about this story. Okay, the guy goes out at 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock. And he's a cheapskate. He inches through the day. He doesn't grab all he can and find he needs more. So he's secure that he can saunter out whenever he wants, and there'll still be people looking for work at high harvest in the vineyard. Now, isn't that marvelous how that works out? I'm the owner, and everything is in my favor. Instead of paying top denarius to get anyone to work for me, there's lots of people all the day. And I can go out and twice in this parable, even in the short version we have, he finds them standing in the morning, and I think it's 5 o'clock or so. They're still standing, and he says, "Why stand you here all the day idle?" Now, I'm imagining the audience. They would be furious by then, because many of them would have stood, and maybe some of them are slaves running the vineyard for an absentee master. So there could be all sorts of people. So they won't all be on Jesus' side necessarily. Don't presume that. So blame the victim. That's why we have so many poor people. They're just lazy. They stand there all the day idle. I mean, this one honestly jumps off the page for me. I don't even find it possible that anyone in the first would say, "Oh, isn't he nice? Such a nice guy, just like God." I mean, whatever you think about God, that's a separate issue. or Milton's blindness, or anything else you want to bring in there. This is a story that if it doesn't provoke the audience, I can't imagine it not, to be honest with you. Why stand you here all the day idle? And they say, I'm imagining through gritted teeth, because nobody hired us, as well,
Mhm. Yeah. All right. Stephen said the Greek word for interest, tokos, means money giving birth. Aristotle called that unnatural. What is the parable of the talents actually about? And which servant is Jesus asking his audience to argue about?
Well, we're in the same thing. Obviously, the whole Jewish tradition in the Torah everywhere is against taking interest. Now, you can watch the Jewish law time and time again trying to get around that, but it's quite clear. You don't take interest, at least off your own compatriots. So forget for the moment our banking system or anything else. For the Romans, of course, interest is a natural part of life, of course. And we know the argument. If you loan me a cow and the cow gives birth, who owns the heifer? Okay, fine. I recognize the thing. Well, then if I gave you the money to buy a cow, yeah, I understand the argument. But at least this makes you think a little bit. Now, if the Jewish tradition is against interest and the Roman is for interest, how come two traditions are like that? What is one seeing and the other ignoring? Not seeing, but saying, there's more important stuff here. Making money is more important. So it would seem to be that they would say, well, the two people who really go for interest, and there's no way they're going to make that much money that fast, by the way, unless they go for interest. I don't think they're hiring out or anything else. So do you come with the two or go with the third one? You could argue, well, you go with the majority. Yeah, but if you go with the majority on the Samaritan parable, you're going to be wrong. The first two are the wrong ones. It's the third one who's the right one. Oh, I heard that Samaritan parable. Somebody might be thinking, as it were, I wonder if this is like that the first two are the wrong ones and the third, and they start arguing. And if they don't argue, once again, if everyone says, oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, we know we shouldn't take interest. No good. Or they say, well, of course you take interest. If you don't have a debate, a dispute, a thoughtful response, then it hasn't worked. And that's why you can only say what might have happened. You learn the whole sociology of the situation and you say, well, in that situation, I imagine, and of course, some exegetes have sometimes, a colleague I know who was teaching the Bible in the prison, and he experimented with some of these parables on prisoners and got very interesting responses and arguments, by the way. That's the best we can do to try and understand what's going on. Thank you, Stephen.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anne, the Jewish law forbids lending at interest. Roman law depends on it, like you just said. The servant who buried the money refused to play. Is he the villain of that parable or the hero? And what does your answer say about where you stand?
Yes, and in a way, that's just what we've said before. It forces the audience to take a stand, or else to just, say nothing. But I have to insist that I think Jesus' parables took at least an hour. Now, I've no problem with what we have there is like a story summary, like you might get if you're watching television and you have a little couple of sentences that tells you what this is about. There's nothing wrong with it. It could be totally accurate. But of course, if Jesus told the Good Samaritan, I don't know how long it takes, let's say a minute or two, a cough in the crowd, a baby crying could obliterate the word Samaritan and blow the whole thing. So, of course, let Jesus work it out and repeat and all the rest of it. But these are summaries of it. And yes, I think that's the whole point, Anne, of this. Which side are you on? Roman law or Jewish law? Are you still with your people, or are you with the usurpers and the occupiers?
Yeah. Yeah. And that connects to the kind of contrast of the two kinds of justice that you've talked about before.
Yes, that's what it goes back down to, of course.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about justice as distributive justice, and distributive justice in the Bible goes back to the fact, given in the Bible, that the first thing God does is distribute existence to everything. That's where it starts. In Genesis 1, God gives existence to everyone, and it gives responsibility for the world to us. That's giving. So distributive justice in the Bible is not a suggestion or a law or a decree of God. It is the very nature of the biblical God. Otherwise, there would be no creation and we wouldn't have all this discussion. So in the Bible, God is distributive justice. That's how it's manifest.
Yeah. All right. Roberto's
sorry,
question.
Sorry, Roberta. I was
Yeah.
ignoring you. Sorry, Roberta. You call Ruth. I'm sorry. I should.
It's all good. You call Ruth, Jonah, and Job challenge parables of the Hebrew Bible. What is each one challenging, and which one do you find most theologically dangerous?
All right. The general situation, I think, is the post-exilic period, when, in one sense, as we saw before, the Persians have sent them back to set up their law and everything else. And I think, understandably, it's kind of iron time. We are going to set this up so it never goes wrong again. We've almost lost our whole country and our whole people. So now, for example, thinking about Ruth, you have the decrees of Nehemiah, Ezra, no mixed marriages. Then you have to divorce. Yes, if you're in a mixed marriage, that would be a Jew, say, with a pagan and plain language, you must divorce. And along comes a story, Ruth. Now read it. As you read through it, what you're thinking of, this destroys the whole story of bad mother-in-laws, daughter-in-laws. It's a lovely story, and everything is beautiful. And then the kicker in the last line is, you find that Ruth the Moabitess, it's beaten. She's a Moabite. And she's I've forgotten how many generations, but the great, how many grandmother of David? So the ideal once and future king of Israel is descended from a mixed marriage. Now imagine that in the middle of the post-exilic restoration, when in one sense you want everything nice, straight. No, this is not a time for objections. This is not a time for discussion. This is a time for putting ourselves back together. We recognize the solution. The slogan was, make Israel great again. And it's quite understandable. They've almost lost out. Only the Persians sent them back, as we saw before. Now, along comes this story, Ruth. Bad enough. Now, what about Jonah? This Jonah is a story about a unbelievably disobedient prophet. He's told to go eastward to Nineveh, and he goes westward to Tarshish. Well, prophets don't do that. Prophets get called by God and say, yeah, send me. Hineni, send me. They don't go in the opposite direction. And God doesn't get mad at him at all. God just sends a big guppy to get him back on track. And he goes back, and then the Ninevites all repent, even the animals repent. Now, anyone could see that that's a comic lampoon of a prophet, a bad prophet, and a good Ninevites of all people, Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. That's the sort of thing really annoys you. But first you think, are all prophets always right and always good? And are Ninevites the worst pagans on record? Read the Bible for what happens to read the book of Nahum on the Ninevites, and you see how they love them. How sure are we of all of these ins and outs and thems and us's and all the way we structure the world? It's a challenge parable is a tiny pin next to a big balloon. Big balloon, but a tiny pin. And then, of course, above all else, there is the book of Job. And, when you read Job, please, we, the reader, know exactly what happens. We know the truth. It's all about the honor of God. He's up in heaven, and the Satan, who's like his inspector general, says, well, there's this guy, and he's just he's playing you, God. He's in it for the goodies. And God said, no, he's the holiest man on earth. Okay, so the honor of God is at stake. Okay, we give him a test. Take everything. See what happens. But poor Job was never told the truth. At the end, God gives him his camels back. Good, that's fine. He gets everything back. But God never says, I'm very sorry. It was about me, not about you. You were just a guinea pig in the great experiment of whether you were really holy to be holy or holy for your goodies, and you were holy to be holy. Congratulations. Why doesn't God tell Job the truth? We all know it, and we know at the end. And we're not going to buy, God is a beyond human knowledge bunk. We know what's going on, and Job doesn't. So that even challenges the biblical idea of God, not just the Deuteronomic principle, because we have 4 Deuteronomic fundamentalists operating in there, and they're all disqualified. Wow. This is a one to make you think. So thank you, Roberto.
Yeah. And Kate has a question there because you used Robert Frost's reading of Job in the lecture. Robert Frost imagines God apologizing to Job and saying, my thanks for releasing me from moral bondage to the human race. What does that mean, and why does God say Job freed him rather than the other way around?
Yeah, I loved that, Kate. It's his, I think it was written in 1945, A Mask of Reason. And the fabulous phrase there that I've never forgotten when I said first. God says to Job, it was to stultify the Deuteronomist. Now, the Deuteronomist is, of course, the book of Deuteronomy. Everything is, if you are good, God rewards you here on earth. If you're bad, God punishes you here on earth, and everything is all set up and done here on earth. And what Job does is stultify, render stupid. Stultus is the Latin word for stupid. Render stupid the Deuteronomy. But the Deuteronomic theory runs the whole Bible up until the book of Daniel. God punishes here below, God rewards here below. To stultify the Deuteronomist. So God explains that, my job before was just rewarding punishment. I was frazzled trying rewarding, punishing. I was so busy. I had no time to be God. I was just the great recorder, as it were. Now, at least I can be God. It's a fabulous short, by the way, it's a short play. I don't know, my copy is maybe a dozen pages or something. So it's easy to read. I don't know if it's available free on the web somewhere, but probably it's well worth reading. At least that section about stultifying the Deuteronomist. But it didn't work, by the way. The book of Job became what I would call a speed bump on the Deuteronomic highway, which goes right on afterwards, right into the New Testament, when the disciples asked Jesus for the man born blind, who's getting punished here, him or his parents? We still think it after there's a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
What did we do wrong?
Yeah. All right. Jerome's question You describe Fielding's Joseph Andrews as a better retelling of the Good Samaritan than Luke's. What does Fielding get right that Luke misses? And what does it say that a novelist in 1742 found what a gospel writer smoothed over?
Yeah, I just ran into that years ago by coincidence. And what struck me is you have this story. There's a guy in the ditch, and the description makes you immediately think of the Good Samaritan. Along comes a coach, and there's three people outside. There's the driver, the postilion, who's the rider on the first lead horse, who therefore would be splattered with mud and had an awful job, and the footman. So three outsiders and three insiders, a woman, an old man, and a lawyer. And of course, Fielding himself is a lawyer. Now, as the story goes on, what do they want to do about the guy in the ditch? He's naked, by the way, stripped naked. And they have all sorts of discussions. Well, yeah, but the lady said, well, of course I do it, but he's naked. So, it's marvelous listening to them all judging whether he wouldn't do it. And the lawyer is fabulous. He keeps saying, well, I don't want him in here, but, we could get sued if somebody finds out that we passed him by. So no moral arguments. And the guy who finally takes off his cloak is the postilion, the poorest one on the job. So, and he, by the way, is mentioned that later he becomes a thief. So the most you might expect don't do it. There's three of them. Well, there's six in all. So Fielding is not working with three, he's working with six. And the postilion does it. I mean, I can't not see that except as a guy, a comic writer, of course, a comic critic, social critic, like Fielding, reading that he must have, of course, known the Good Samaritan, seeing the possibilities of it and mirrors it. Mm-hmm. On steroids, you might say. Thank you, Jerome.
Yeah. All right. From Lisa, you've built to this across 4 lectures. Parables are a participatory pedagogy for a participatory God. Can you state the whole argument plainly? Why this medium for this message and why no other medium will do?
Okay, basically, Lisa, the argument I've been making is, as I understand the message of Jesus, he is basically saying speaking into a apocalyptic situation and waiting for God to do it for them. No, God is waiting for you to collaborate. That's what I distinguish Jesus from John the Baptist. And it's not a put down, by the way. It really isn't a put down. It's to say that because somebody is in a tradition, they could also set the tradition on its head, but they're still in the tradition. They're presuming people will know this and they'll recognize it upside down. So participatory pedagogy, I find that in the Torah. What's the point of God giving a Torah, as it were, unless there's a cooperation going on there? Prophets, wisdom, the same thing. So I think Jesus, in a way, is calling his fellow Jews back to their ancient tradition, away from the interruption that had begun 160 years earlier with the apocalyptic tradition. So when I see that, and I find parables appropriate. But by the way, I wrote a book in parables way back in 60, 63 or whatever. I also, a few years later, wrote one in aphorisms. Aphorisms are the same thing. They're very short sayings. They look like a kind of a proverb, but love your enemies. Or blessed are the poor. This guy's nuts. So you can have a very short story or a very short saying doing exactly the same thing, luring you, seducing you, provoking you into active thought. I just did one very recently when I said this is an example of an aphorism to make you think. We're not the Titanic, we're the iceberg. Now, your first reaction to that is, ew. So aphorisms work just as well in a way. They're very short and they sound like proverbs. We say that's not proverb. A stitch in time saves 9. That's kind of wisdom. Love your enemies. So, Lisa, I think aphorisms also work for Jesus. So I'm not surprised he's using aphorisms and parables for the same purpose.
Mm-hmm. All right. Colm asks, if a parable works by provoking argument rather than delivering answers, What is that demand of the preacher? Is it even possible to preach a challenge parable without domesticating it into an example?
Oh, that is the question. But I think it can be done. I mean, in one sense, if I can come down from the sublime to the ridiculous, what I'm trying to do, Colin, is talk about the Roman Empire. Do you really think I care that much about the Roman Empire and the first century? I see it as a giant parable in a way about us now. So yes, you can do it. You can do it if you know. I'm going to say if you know what you're doing. No, you can do it if you want to do it. Column. Let me. By the way, I don't know if this is the first, but there's a set of very Irish names that came up on the questions. There were 7 of them. Colin was one of them, and I don't know if they're all coming up now, but I'm going to ask you a question, Colin. I know you can't answer. I'm wondering if you're a real person along with 6 other people with very traditional Irish names. Are you in Ireland, or are you using made up Irish names in honor of St. Patrick's? But anyway, I recognize that Colum, short for Columba, the dove, is a very Irish, male Irish name. Thank you, Colum.
Well, we, I really hope you message in and let us know, because I didn't notice. Sent them to Dom, and he goes, "Where did all the Irish people come from?"
Terribly Irish names. Obviously, other people like myself can have an ordinary name and not give it away. Cormac, here's another one.
All
Cormac,
right.
for example. Okay, Cormac.
You say if the audience walks away thinking they got a lesson on sewing, Jesus blew it. How do you know when you've provoked rather than just confused? And what does a successful parable leave behind?
Well, it leaves behind, Cormac, as we now know, an action. It makes you think into action. The situation of Jesus, of course, is an occupied country run by autocratic Roman Empire. So that is the taken for granted situation. I don't know if it would work exactly in a totally different situation, but until there is no more autocracy on the world, I presume Jesus has something going here. So if you don't think it's about sowing, or even if you think that the Good Samaritan is just about compassion, that's a more serious one, because yes, of course, it's about compassion. It presumes compassion. So does this presume sowing? It doesn't work unless, if rocks are good for wheat or barley, then it doesn't work. So there's a substratum taken for granted. And if they only get the substratum, as it were, then it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. It doesn't work. So you know when your audience is provoked, you'll know it. You know it because you probably won't be invited back to preach the next Sunday. So that's one way of knowing that you got through. It's not infallible, but sometimes you'll know.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you,
All right. Eamon?
Amen.
Eamon? All right.
Amen.
You've spent 50 years arguing for a participatory God in a participatory medium. Has the argument cost you anything? And does it still feel as urgent now as when you started?
Well, to begin at the end, Eamon, yeah, it's much more urgent now, because I think we were deluded into thinking that on a kind of an evolutionary line that democracy was here, and it was just it. We had arrived there. We would never go back. We would get better, hopefully, and all the rest of it. All of a sudden, we found slouching towards Bethlehem, what was autocracy was right back in fashion. So yes, it's more urgent than ever. At least I'm talking about my own country, America. As you may know, I came from Ireland. I was in this country I came in 51 as a student, back in 61 on a green card, stayed on a green card until 2000. And the reason I became a citizen is because I was afraid. That's the truth, honestly. I told Sarah in 1997, when Newt Gingrich brought out what I call his contract on America, that this country frightens me. The government of this country frightens me. I don't think it's safe to be on a green card anymore. This was 97. I'm going to become a citizen, and by 2000, I was a citizen. So now, go back to 50 years arguing. I left the priesthood in 1969. What am I talking about? Yeah, 1969. I have to think now. Did I suffer? No, no. There was about 9 months when I knew I was leaving the priesthood and the monastery, and I didn't know what was going to happen. But at the end of that 9 months, I was an associate professor at DePaul University in Chicago. So no, I didn't suffer. I didn't. I really did, compared to some people who suffered. But I just knew that I couldn't do what I wanted to do biblically and truthfully and remain an obedient priest. So one had to go. So the argument basically was the God that I've always found in the Bible is a participatory God. It was a kind of a surprise to try and handle what I call this idea that God was going to do it all for us if we were just patient enough and pray enough. And I understand it. Compared to the Roman Empire, I could see somebody saying, I give up. I can understand somebody who's gone through or knows about the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, the Syrians again, the Egyptians, and the Romans. Oh, you give up. They're getting stronger. The empires are getting stronger. Where's this reign of God? So I understand it. I understand it. But it's still a participatory God, and the challenge is still us. Thank you, Eamon.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you also got to be married to Sarah when you left. And anyone that's got to spend time with both of you knows what a blessing that has been to you. So,
oh yeah, oh yes, that my beloved Sarah, very much yes.
All right, from Peter, the shift from Jesus' open sharing meals to the early church's ritualized Eucharist, is that the same kind of institutional slippage as a challenge parable becoming an allegory about Jesus?
I don't think so, Peter, because in the way what I read, especially is Paul's experience at Corinth when the Corinthians were busy turning a share meal in which the important thing is that you break bread. In other words, there's one piece of bread for everyone. That's not the way the Romans did. They had all their little tables, three-legged tables, and your bread is on it. Nothing wrong with that. And your wine cup is on it. They have the same cup. So it's the breaking of the bread and the passing of the cup. So everything points to unity. Now, I'm not imagining a Last Supper as we have it in the New Testament, sorry. But what I am imagining is that Jesus shared bread and fish, for example, during his life. Now, he was killed for it. He was killed for demanding justice, fair distribution. So we now have body and blood. Wait a minute. Body and soul are what we usually think of separation when a body and soul is separate. Body and blood is separated. That's a murder or an execution or something. So to celebrate the body and blood of Jesus means, as Paul tells you, don't do it unless you know what you're doing. You're making a public statement that you are ready to risk the death that Jesus underwent to follow him. That, says Paul, is what it's all about. You're taking the bread and wine and you're saying it represents, and don't get into does it really represent or symbolically represents. If you're going to die for it, it's real. So I don't find anything wrong there. Now, when you put the whole thing back into Jesus and all the rest of it and make it kind of magic, then it loses. But read Paul telling the Corinthians, here's what you're doing. Know what you're doing. You're making a public statement by eating a separated body and blood, as it were, that you will die for the same thing that Jesus died for, if you have to. Wow. I would say that's as much a challenge as you can imagine. I can't imagine it's a ritual challenge.
Yeah.
And of course, the church's job is not to kill it, not to make it just sort of a magic ritual, very personal, you and Jesus somehow. It's a group commitment. So I don't find it an allegory about Jesus so much as a challenge parable of which Jesus is a challenge. His death is a challenge.
Well, an enacted an enacted ritual is very much like a metaphor in action, and it's inviting us to make the metaphor a reality, Tom. So someone has said that a number of times to me.
Well, an example of the death of Herod, this would be 4 BCE, there was a huge golden eagle. I think it must have been on probably the west side, probably around where the Wailing Wall is now, a huge golden eagle on the temple saying, we're under you, Rome. Don't get worried about this giant fortress here. Ooh, we're Roman. And a whole bunch of the Pharisees and their students went up and tried to remove it. Now, it didn't attack the temple. I don't think it was violent. It was a demonstration. Deadly dangerous, and a lot of them died, of course, but there was nothing about them fighting back. They were removing the eagle. So that's a dangerous thing. It wasn't just aesthetics. We kind of don't like the eagle. It's kind of big. No, ritual things can be just as dangerous, as we know from demonstrations.
Yeah. All right. Maya asks, the mustard seed describes the kingdom as weed-like, unstoppable growth. How does that image directly confront the violent, cataclysmic cleansing expected by Jewish apocalyptic prophets?
But Maya, if I can even extend your question, I don't think that the apocalyptic imagination can be so focused on the earth and the details of the earth as Jesus is. I don't think so. If I'm imagining God coming and the earth is going to be absolutely transformed, if I am in some apocalyptic scenarios at least, I don't think I'm watching the lilies of the field. It's a different imagination. So I find the ordinariness, but the profound orderliness of Jesus's images is not apocalyptic. It's kind of ridiculous to try and imagine an apocalyptic scenario. Just read John's Apocalypse. Look at his scenarios. There's not too much of this small stuff. There are, of course, parables all over the place. These angelics pouring out slaughter on the earth. I hope there's a parable. So the interesting thing about the mustard seed is that it imagines growth. And it's a parable, by the way, which has 2 independent attestations, one in Mark and one in Q. And it imagines growth, development. Well, the apocalypse is usually bang, crash. Zoo. Obviously, you can talk about 1,000 years. I know all that stuff. So the whole idea of parables using nature and ordinary social conventions, I think that imagination is different from the apocalyptic imagination, even when the apocalyptic imagination might be right.
Yeah. All right. Ruth asks, you use Kafka, Fielding to explain how parables work. How important is it for Christians to read secular fiction and poetry to retrain their imaginations for reading the Bible at all?
Oh, Ruth, thank you very much. I mean, I don't know how not to do it, because if you're not at home in metaphor, and with the power of metaphor, and the power of parable, which is simply a metaphor blown up into a story, as it were. A metaphor would be like Good Samaritan. Now, make me a story about a Good Samaritan, you got yourself a parable. If you're not into how a metaphor creates our world, and you think, well, that's just metaphor. It's fancy stuff. It's like the icing on the cake, but the cake is still there without it. I don't know how you can handle the Bible, except by fundamentalists. And then you end up with double fundamentalisms, one group of people taking it all literally and loving it, and the other anti-fundamentalists taking it all literally and hating it. But they're both taking it literally, and they both lost it. It's like my very sarcastic example is Mary had a little lamb if Jesus is the Lamb of God. No, Jesus is the Lamb of God, but it doesn't mean that Mary had a little lamb. So, we know that. We know that. And that's not even nice to say. Everyone gets that. Behold the Lamb of God, and Jesus ain't bleeding. But then there's others, there's bigger ones, and we get lost in there. We catch the small metaphors. We always do.
Yeah.
But We don't get the big ones because we're inside them. So it's, if you don't have a sense that metaphor creates the world, then I don't think you're ready for the Bible or for much of life, to be honest with you.
All right. Greg asks, you've written about cosmic eschatology. How does the humor and irony in Jesus' parables help people survive civilizational despair, ecological collapse, systemic inequality without nihilism?
Well, Greg, that's what we have to do. I think there's a comic edge to what Jesus is doing, really. All of these parables could make people laugh when they get into the argument about what they mean. And one of the things we can do and must do to keep our own humanity against autocracy is learning to laugh at least inside. Never, never, never agree with it. You may not be ready to make a demonstration outside. You may not be ready to even speak against autocracy, but never, never accept it as the normalcy of life. That's our first great resistance. I don't believe that. I don't think that is right. I may be afraid to say it. I may be afraid to do much about it, but at least I know. It may not be enough. You might say, well, it's not. But if you don't start there, then it may go to the titles that you use and other things. But comic eschatology is the first great anti-eschatology, because Rome had an eschatology, by the way. It wasn't just an occupying country. They were the will of God for the world. Now, the first thing you have to do about that is giggle. It's not enough, but at least it's a start. And that's comic. It can get you killed, of course, in the right situation.
Yeah. All
Thank
right. Judith asks, how does Antipas's commercialization of Galilee, absentee landlords, peasant debt, and closed commons transform agricultural parables like the wicked talents into acts of political provocation?
Yeah, we've touched on that before, Judith. That's the more you understand the situation in Galilee, the more you will find it, at least I find it, impossible not to think of that response. It's not that you suddenly see it. It's that when you know the background and the matrix, as I call it, of it, it's hard not to get it any more than if you're watching, a Lampoon or Saturday Night Live, you wouldn't get it. You might like it, you might dislike it. But you get it when you dislike it too. So I think all of that matrix, that agricultural matrix, makes it inevitable that Jesus gets that type of response. Thank you, Judith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, watching some old SNL sketches with your kids, you realize how much you have to explain of what was going on when it happened for them to get the jokes.
Yes. Imagine trying to parse laughing.
Yeah.
Go back to the 60s even farther.
All right. Sarah asks, does the modern Christian obsession with the rapture and Revelation's violent Jesus fundamentally destroy the collaborative pedagogy Jesus tried to establish through parables? And in her longer email, this was in response to the head of the Department of War leveraging the apocalyptic eschatology stuff when talking about our current war.
Sarah, the answer is simply yes. Of course. It is. We tend to say that Jesus was the Messiah Christ, but Judaism did not accept him. Now, the other truth is neither did Christianity. It said, well, yeah, he was the Messiah Christ, but he has to come back a second time to get it right. So in both cases, you're looking at Jesus's challenge and you're saying, no. Yes, it is the answer, the opposite answer. And understand it historically. It's not evil people. It's not. It's quite understandable how certain people, starting, as I said, from the time of the Maccabees, and the Maccabees were the exception, at least the warrior Maccabees, that we just can't do it. We can't handle Rome. How do you handle Rome? And we're in the middle of the Pax Romana too. So we give up. We give up. God, we're waiting. It's absolutely understandable. Absolutely understandable. but that doesn't make it right or make it valid. So we have to understand it, at least in the first century. Whether I think about it in the 20th century for Americans, that's a luxury. We are the oppressed people. No, in the first century, I do understand it, and part of it is I'm Irish, and I do understand how a great empire can seem almost too much for you, and how not to give in. So yes, I can understand that. Thank you, Sarah.
All right. Marcus asks, what happens to a parable's meaning when you strip away the frames the gospel writers add, like Luke's go and do likewise, or Matthew's weeping and gnashing of teeth? That's how Southerners say it. And in the larger email, he was wondering like what kind of advice and using what he's learned in the class to get at both what Jesus was saying in the parables, and then to also hear what is the theological voice of each of the evangelists when you start to notice the narrative framing of them.
Thank you, Marcus. And please don't use that bad dental process of gnashing your teeth. It's not good for the dentals. That's where the historical Jesus has to be there. And I think in my own case, it's not, well, I stripped it all away and I said, gee, what have I left? I think that might lead to nihilism, as in the last few questions. I think what happened was I started really, this would be way back in the very early 60s, even when I was still in the monastery. I was teaching Jeremias on the parables. I think I put that on the actual video itself. You can see that. I have a program there when I was teaching the parables at Catholic Theological Union in 68, 69. That's, as you may know, the Pope went there for his MA in the early 70s. So we missed one another, unfortunately. I was teaching Jeremias, and Jeremias is fabulous on stripping away what Mark and Matthew and Luke does. Fabulous. It was great to teach. But what was left very often was a Lutheran Jesus. I'm sorry to say. Every single part where it was stripped away came up with a good Lutheran dogma that Jesus was incarnating. That pushed me, of course, towards, in parables, the challenge of the historical Jesus. It did. So you have to have a historical Jesus, and the historical Jesus is theological. I mean, people say, well, yeah, but what about Christology? If you want to use Christology, why could anyone in the first century, during his life, look at Jesus and say, could this be the Messiah? I find no problem. And I think that's inevitable, because I do not believe that, well, he just went around patting babies and telling little stories. Then he rose from the dead and everyone said, oops, the Messiah. Come on. They wouldn't even have made a claim of rising from the dead if he wasn't the Messiah to begin with. So as far as I am concerned, the historical Jesus, in his full challenge of the reign of God, incarnating it, preaching it, was already there. That's ready. So when you strip this away, I've never felt I lost anything. What I find honest, Mark's understanding of Jesus, for which I have great respect, because it honestly says the gospel according to Mark, according to Matthew, according to Luke. They never say the gospel of Mark. Paul tends to say my gospel. That's true. But again, he knows it's the gospel of Christ. So the good news is Jesus. Now, all the rest is according to him. That's what they say openly and honestly. So when you take away the framing of the parables as we have them, what you get, what you have is Mark's theology, and what you left is the historical Jesus. If you do it with the four vectors, that's the great thing we have. We have the 5 vectors, 6 vectors if you bring in Thomas. We have all of these vectors, and we can see what is there from which all these vectors flow. That's historical Jesus research. And it's fabulous fun.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marcus.
All right, we'll try to do 3 more before we wrap up here. Deborah asks, you say Mark turns parables into punitive riddles for outsiders. Does that reflect the Markian community's own experience of rejection and misunderstanding after the catastrophe of 70?
I don't think so, Deborah, because I can't see that in Mark. I can see it very clearly in Q before 70, actually. They're hurt people. I don't get that at all. Mark is fighting internally with the disciples of Jesus, who are all long gone, but probably the ones who had the power in Jerusalem beforehand. So it's an internal one, and it's a critique, very much, not just of those at the time of Jesus who didn't understand, but he's saying, and you people too, you relatives of Jesus, like James of Jerusalem, you, the 12, like Peter, like James and John, like Judas, you didn't get it either. So he's using it to criticize more internally, I think. Jesus explains to the disciples, but they don't get it either. That's Mark. And it's a devastating gospel of critique. Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah. All right. Fatima asks, the Gospel of Thomas frames the Great Supper with a warning that buyers and merchants won't enter the Father's places. What does that tell us about Thomas's community's relationship to the material world?
As I understand Thomas, Fatima, it is basically ascetic. I don't think it's Gnostic. I think it is ascetic. I think it's ascetic both with regard to sex and marriage and material goods. Yes, I think they are an ascetic community, and this is part of their asceticism. That's the way I understand the logic of what Thomas is about. Thank you, Fatima.
All right. And last question here. One I think makes explicit what was going on in the lecture. The talents parable places the audience at the crossroads of Roman law, where interest is natural, and Torah, where it's forbidden. Is that parable actually a challenge to choose between Caesar and God?
Okay, now, Scott, I think, and everyone else, I've given you my argument for it. You're absolutely free to say I'm not persuaded. So what I would ask you to do is, take that as an example, go back and read what's on the video, because I try to give you enough of the text that you can figure it out for yourself from it, and see what you think. Are you persuaded? This is what a parable. If at the end of it you're not, then that's it. Test it, because I will not give you an opinion without giving you my evidence, and that means you can then take it as well. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Scott.
All right. Well, thank you, Dom, and thank you everyone who's been joining live and those that send in questions. We've already got a number of questions that are from the series as a whole, along with connecting with previous classes Dom and I have got to do together. But we'd love for you to send questions for our last Q&A as we are heading into Holy Week and everything. And all you got to do is respond to any of the class emails. If you haven't joined up, you can head over to crossanclass.com and do that. And we'll be back here next week at the same time, unless there's an apocalyptic explosion or something like that.
And happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone.